first of all, I would just like to give a disclaimer that I have a thick booklet and I'm just going to read from it, mostly because there's a lot of things that I want to say, and I'm also going to cry. I'm just going to throw that out there. So if I do cry, it's okay, and everyone else can cry with me too, so there's that. So, hello everyone, I'm Maddie Wolf, and today I'm going to tell the story of my struggle with anxiety, my cousin Anna's struggle with depression, which ultimately led to her death, and how I've dealt with both of these. So, oh my gosh. Today I have 8 key lessons that I've learned throughout this entire experience the past year and a half or so since this has happened. And I hope that by the end of this presentation, you'll have a better understanding of what mental illness is, why suicide can occur, and what you can do to help those around you who might be struggling with mental illness or suicide. And now, onto what I like to call the bad part. So my cousin Anna and I grew up in Excelsior, Minnesota, which in case some of you don't know, it's a small town that's nestled in Gideon Bay and Excelsior Bay on Lake Minnetonka. It's about 40 minutes west of Minneapolis, and it's known for being a nice, relatively wealthy part of the Minneapolis suburbs. Growing up, Anna and I both had a really close-knit, loving family. For example, my furthest relatives from where I lived in Plymouth, which you can look on this map and see it's just north of where we live, so it's about a half an hour away. I'm the second child in a family of 6, and I had a pretty normal childhood. I participated in a lot of activities like violin, soccer, dance, choir, school newspaper, and more. And I always did really well in school, and I took a lot of advanced classes. I had plenty of friends to hang out with, and I made it into a lot of after-school teams and clubs. But despite all of this, I still, around the age of 14 to 15 years old, I started to have some anxiety issues. My cousin Anna, so just to point this out, on the left is my Aunt Tony. In the middle, on the left, is my cousin Anna. Next to her is her brother Leo, and then on the far right is my uncle Al. So Anna is the second child in a family of 4, and she also had what I would call a normal childhood, but everyone says they have a normal childhood. She's Guatemalan, and she was adopted by her parents when she was just 5 months old. She loved fishing, she loved finding worms and frogs and being outdoors all the time. And she first started to show some anxiety symptoms when she was just in kindergarten. She was afraid to walk down the hall because she was thinking that everybody was staring at her and judging her because she looked different from the rest of us. And as she got older, she tried things like soccer, violin, Girl Scouts, she volunteered with the elderly, and she went and helped at daycare at church. But around the time she got into middle school, she also started to struggle with her homework, and she started to feel like she didn't have the friendships that she should have. So this leads us to the first lesson, that mental illness doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care what you look like, it doesn't care where you're from, who your family is, or who your friends are. Just like any other disease, if you have mental illness, you have mental illness, regardless of your environment. When my anxiety first started to show up around age 14 or 15, I didn't immediately recognize it. I was able to cope with it pretty well, and I was able to keep it all contained within me. So some ways it kind of started to leak out was that I would come home from school on Friday and I'd fall asleep on the couch at 4:30 in the afternoon and then not wake up until noon the next day. I would cry randomly and without reason, but the worst part of my anxiety was that it would start to tell me these lies. The reason I didn't recognize these lies though is because they came and they sounded like my own voice, telling me that nothing I did was enough, who I was wasn't enough, and that there was no way for me to live up to the expectations I had for myself because I wasn't good enough. So I have the photo of a cake that my Aunt Tony actually got for me because I found out that I was going to NYU and we had a graduation party for me. And the reason I have this photo is because the area that I struggled the most with in finding my worth was academics. For Anna, it was very similar. So her anxiety and depression came in her own voice, and it lied to her as well. It would tell her that she didn't have the relationships that she should be having with other people or even with herself. It told her that she looked different from others and that they judged her because of it. There was nothing that she could do to live up to the expectations that she thought that she had to reach. And so for Anna, I have a photo of her with her close friend and mentor, since what she struggled the most with was finding her worth in the relationships that she had with other people. So that brings us to the second lesson, that mental illness comes in the form of lies and it comes disguised as your own voice. It will tell you a lot of different things, but when you boil it all down, the one resonating message is that it will tell you that you are not enough. Without getting too far into details, I think it's enough to say that growing up, and even still today, I struggle with anxiety. And Anna struggled with anxiety, and later on in her life, she primarily struggled with depression. But mental illness on its own doesn't always mean that somebody is going to die from suicide. It's obviously a very big risk factor, but it's not a guarantee. And so mental illness and suicide are very complex and nuanced, and it's really hard to boil it all down to a single cause. So with that in mind, I wanted to share with you a couple of things that happened in the past few years that I think contributed to Anna's death and the peak of my struggle with anxiety. So in January 2015, just after Christmas, Anna's and my grandpa Larry passed away. He was very close to our family, and of course, any death can be difficult to deal with. And he was the first close family death for us, and it definitely affected us. Then, in September 2015, there was the Short family murder-suicide. And when this story first broke the news, I was shocked to discover that there was a family in Minnetonka that had been murdered. And then I realized that this family lived just a couple blocks away from my cousin Anna's home. And then I found out that the youngest daughter in this family of 5, her name was Brooklyn, and she was one of my cousin's best friends. So on the left is my cousin Anna, and on the right is Brooklyn Short. There's no need to go into too much detail on this, but I think it's important to tell the Short family story. So the Short family, actually going back one slide, they lived in a $2 million home on Lake Minnetonka. It was 5,600 square feet, and Brian Short, the father, he started his own business called allnurses.com. So from the outside, it's pretty easy to see that life was probably pretty good. We'll never know the truth of why this happened, but in September, Brian Short purchased a shotgun, then one night proceeded to kill his wife and children before turning the gun on himself. And the reason that I wanted to talk about this story in particular is that it was extremely traumatic for my cousin, as well as everybody around us. And then also because of this quote from the Star Tribune. A representative from allnurses.com, the business where Brian Short worked, said, "They seemed like a great family, everything was perfect." And I think that we're all aware now, from lesson 1, we know that it doesn't matter how perfect something may seem, anyone can struggle with mental illness. And I also believe that in Minnetonka, there might be an excessive focus on achievement and outward success, which can contribute to things like this. So in any case, these 2 deaths, my grandpa Larry's and Brooklyn Short's, I think contributed significantly to my cousin's death. So that brings us to this next lesson, that there's no single cause to suicide. And according to the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, it most often occurs when stressors exceed the current coping abilities of somebody suffering from a mental health condition. This was the case for my cousin Anna, who on January 30th, 2016, at 15 years of age, hung herself in her basement and passed away on January 31st. To say I was sad would be an understatement. I would say that the grief was overwhelming. But with that said, there was one truly incredible thing that happened after Anna's death. Anna's parents, my Aunt Tony and Uncle Al, chose to be incredibly open about the situation. They shared in her obituary and with the news that it was a suicide, and that it happened because of the struggles that Anna had with depression leading up to her death. They acknowledged that Anna had attempted suicide before, and they encouraged everyone to keep talking about it and learning about suicide and mental health. So obviously, this is a big part of why I was able to apply for the Founders Grant in 2016, and why I'm even able to speak about it here today. Sorry. As a result of my aunt and uncle being so open about it, I was able to start speaking out about it as well. So after sharing my story last year at the Ogon, I had dozens of you come up and talk to me about how you could help me with my project, or you shared your own experience of losing someone to suicide. So I try every day to post about Anna, my own struggles, mental health, and suicide on my social media pages, and all the time I get messages like this. People reaching out and telling me what their story has been, that they had the same issues that my cousin had or I had in high school, and they're just so glad that they're not the only one. So this brings us to the next lesson, that one of the best ways to fight against mental illness is to put it in the spotlight. In the past year, I've seen many people start to speak out about their own struggles after I share mine, and that's been truly incredible. And now, we can get on to the healing part. So after Anna's death, I needed to speak with somebody about it. Her death combined with my anxiety was just too much to handle, and so I went to therapy. I think it was probably my 4th or 5th session in when I was talking about my cousin's death that my therapist looked at me and said, "Maddie, has anyone told you that you are enough?" And tears started to well up in my eyes because for the first time in my life, an outsider had looked at me and told me that I was enough. He had no reason to tell me that, and he certainly wasn't trying to appeal to my ego. And then it finally hit me. Maybe he's right. Maybe I am enough. And I'm crying because I wish that my cousin knew that. It's one thing to be told that you're enough, but it's another thing to truly believe it. And after being lied to by my anxiety for so long that I wasn't enough, it was like I could finally look at my life and see it clearly for once. So that's the first and most important lesson that I learned in the healing process. That you are enough. Or, like Matt said in his presentation, you have value and you have worth. And if you don't believe that today, or you think that you believe it, but you're brushing it off, then you need to keep thinking about it. And you need to keep saying it until you actually do start to believe it. And once you believe that you're enough, you'll also start to be kinder and more patient and more compassionate to others. When I was finally able to accept that I'm enough just as I am, I was able to look at others and recognize them as enough too, including my cousin. The next thing that I learned was a little more subtle. So first I'm going to start by talking a little bit about anxiety. So working in this business, I'm sure that you all have experienced times of high stress, even if you haven't experienced necessarily a panic attack. A lot of the symptoms of stress are similar to those of a panic attack. But in a panic attack, many people feel numbness. They might feel tingling and dizziness and chest pain. You might have nausea, shortness of breath, heart palpitations. You can also start to think in your mind that you're going crazy, or you have this imminent sense of doom, or that you're going to die. A lot of people actually misdiagnose their panic attack as a heart attack because it's such a visceral experience. And I personally think that's really a testament to the power of your mind. When my anxiety is at its worst, I start to feel a lot of these symptoms, but the most terrifying symptom is feeling like you can't breathe. I've never experienced drowning, but I imagine that it might be something like having a panic attack, that you desperately need to get air into your lungs, but you just can't get air. The only way to cure a panic attack is simply to live through it. But the way that you live through it is by starting to control your breathing. But it's kind of a catch-22 because when you're having a panic attack, it's near impossible to figure out how you're going to breathe. So shifting gears for a moment, after Anna's death, I started taking yoga classes. It wasn't related to her death, it was just to get a form of physical exercise, and a lot of people here do yoga, so I thought I'll give it a try. But I realized that the bigger benefit was actually the internal peace that it brought. And if you've ever taken a yoga class, you've probably heard that the most important thing of the practice is your breath. The instructors are always saying things like, try to make the shapes and then just focus on your breathing. So I would just shrug my shoulders and kind of do whatever they told me to do and pretend. And then just a few months ago, an instructor was having us do a compression exercise, which apparently is called the eagle pose, and I don't know why, because it doesn't look like an eagle to me. But it's when you have to wrap your arms up and your legs up, and then you have to kind of pull yourself into this little ball, and you have to push your arms into your chest. And you're supposed to be making this really tight, kind of uncomfortable position. And then, once we were all in that position, the instructor said, notice your breath in this pose. It's more difficult to get air into your lungs, but you can still do it. It's harder to breathe, but you're still breathing. And then I had this kind of epiphany moment that this weird yoga compression pose didn't feel that different from a panic attack, but in a good way. I was sweating, my chest hurt because I was pushing my arms into it as hard as I could. My heart rate was obviously elevated, and my legs were trembling because I was trying to hold this knot position. I was balancing on one leg. And it was certainly a lot harder to breathe. But unlike in a panic attack, I didn't feel any sense of dread, and I didn't feel like I was going to die, and most importantly, I was still breathing. So that's the next lesson. Discover that you can breathe in tight spaces. Life might get crazy, work might feel overwhelming, your friends might be weird, your dog might be pooping all over the house. If you know my dog, that's the situation almost every day. But the only thing you need to do right now in this moment is keep breathing. And whenever I start to feel like life is getting too overwhelming, or I start to feel a panic attack might be coming on, I try to remind myself that no matter how difficult life might seem, all I need to do in this minute is just breathe. Finally, moving on to the helping others section. So if you don't struggle with mental illness or suicide, then you're probably wondering right now what you can do to support people who do struggle with mental illness. And the single best tip that I can give you is just to show up and listen. When somebody is struggling with depression or anxiety, they just want somebody to be there for them. It doesn't mean you have to give a pump-up speech. It doesn't mean you have to say the right thing. You just have to show up and listen and show that you care. But if you do want to say something to them, don't say things like, just cheer up, or you've been like this before and you've made it through, or even go for a run, you'll feel better. Instead, try and tell them that you understand how they're feeling. Be empathetic, listen to them, tell them you'll listen, and that you're there for them. Tell them that you understand that they're feeling a certain way right now and that you hope it gets better. And then ask them if there's anything that you can do. It's really easy to overlook all of the hurt that's happening in our neighborhood right now, but I'm here to tell you that Anna's story, my story, and the Short Family story are not unique. In Minnesota, there's a student survey that goes out every year, and this year I looked up this year's results for the 9th and 11th graders at Minnetonka High School, but the results are available for any schools in Minnesota, so if you want to look it up, you certainly can. And here are some of the facts that I found. There are 312 students at Minnetonka High School right now who don't feel valued or appreciated. There are 254 students at MHS right now who have considered attempting suicide. And that's roughly the size of this agency. And worst of all, there are 55 students at MHS right now who have attempted suicide. So this brings us to the final lesson, just to love. I had a quote from Mother Teresa, and when I started to do some research on it, I found out that it might not actually be from Mother Teresa, but I'm gonna go with it anyway. So, Mother Teresa supposedly said, if you want to change the world, go home and love your family. And I would add to that we should go home and love our neighbors. Start to look out for people who might be struggling and learn the warning signs for mental illness and suicide. Listen to people and support them. And if you don't feel comfortable doing that, then find somebody else and see if they're comfortable doing that. So you're probably wondering now, what are the warning signs? So there's 3 different columns. There's the talking, the behavior, and then the mood. And I'm going to read them all, so brace yourself. If a person talks about being a burden to others, feeling trapped, experiencing unbearable pain, having no reason to live, or killing themselves. If a person starts to do things like increased use of alcohol or drugs, which, at an agency where we drink a lot, there's a lot. Looking for a way to kill themselves, such as searching online for materials or means, acting recklessly, withdrawing from activities, isolating themselves from family and friends, sleeping too much or too little, visiting or calling people to say goodbye, giving away prized possessions, or aggression. Or if a person displays one or more of the following moods: depression, loss of interest, rage, irritability, humiliation, or anxiety. And if you do notice somebody displaying these symptoms, don't be afraid to just sit down with them in a private area and ask them, hey, how are you doing? I noticed that you've been doing a couple of these things lately, and I just wanted to make sure that you're okay. Do you want to talk about it? I'm here to listen. And as we know from lesson 3, suicide often occurs when there are too many stressors to cope with. So here are some stressors that you should watch out for. When there are mental health conditions such as depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, or anxiety, and more. When there are substance abuse disorders, serious or chronic health condition and or pain, a stressful life event such as a death, divorce, or job loss, prolonged stress factors such as harassment, bullying, relationship problems, or unemployment, access to lethal means including firearms and drugs, exposure to another person's suicide or to graphic or sensationalized accounts of suicide, previous suicide attempts, or a family history of suicide attempts. And if you're looking for more information still, you can come to me certainly, but I'd also encourage you to start with these 4 resources. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention is really all-inclusive, so if you have any questions or you want to know anything else, I'd recommend you go there. It will also cover off on all the basics, and it's where I got the information on the previous 2 slides. I'd also recommend going to the crisis text line. This started because a person got a text at her organization and she didn't know how to respond to this person. So they started a line where you can text instead of having to call. I would also go to makeitokay.org. This is a local initiative, and that's great for having conversations with people. If they say, hey, I'm having an ADD moment, how do you respond to that? This will help you with that. And then finally, I'd recommend if you really want to go deep into this, if you want training, if you want to know how to help somebody when they're having a panic attack or a psychosis issue, then you can do mental health first aid training. And I've done it myself. It's a very long day, but it's well worth it. And it's free depending on the location that you go to. And finally, if you felt moved by my presentation, just like Matt said before, we're collecting donations. You can go see Aisha at the front desk, otherwise there's a table back here at the right. I'll be collecting donations for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and there's also going to be a little bowl of smiley face pins. Because when Anna was a baby, she developed an affinity for this little stuffed animal type thing, which she called a Bubba face. And at her funeral, my aunt and uncle handed out these smiley face pins, which is why I wanted to hand them out today. So I hope that you go take one of these pins and that you keep it, and every time you see it, you remember that you are enough and that you have hope for the future. Thank you.